welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. They are Daniel Gowan and Tyler Calvaruso. We've got plenty to discuss here on our latest episode, as there is a 13th game looming and now just 8 days away at Yankee Stadium. The Pinstripe Bowl awaits. Noon kickoff, December 27th. Our Lions 24/7 coverage team will be in attendance for that matchup against Clemson. We'll talk about that a lot more early next week. In our next episode, we're going to have a guest on who covers the Clemson Tigers, break down their journey to this point, some of their missing players, because both these teams will be missing some starters because of opt-outs and some injuries as well. So we'll break down Clemson. We'll give you our final thoughts on the game, try to get an episode up to you before Christmas. But this episode is primarily going to be about everything going on beyond the playing field right now for Penn State, from the coaching staff to the roster and through the recruiting trail. So we have Daniel and Tyler to help provide that perspective. And we'll begin here with the fact that Penn State is targeting a defensive coordinator, and that is Danton Lynn. He is currently USC's defensive coordinator. He's finishing up his second season out there. It's his third season out in Los Angeles, as prior to this, he was the UCLA defensive coordinator under Chip Kelly. They made a cross-city splash move under Lincoln Riley in 2023 to bring, or 2024 to bring him on board, and he has been there the last couple of seasons. Some significant improvement for USC. They had one of the worst defenses in college football, specifically the Power 4 conference level, before he arrived. You look back at the UCLA tenure, although it was 1 year, he helped improve that from total defense around number 90 nationally for the Bruins to top 10 nationally at UCLA. And of course, when we talk about Lynn, this is a guy who wore a Nittany Lions uniform back in his playing career, went on to play a bit in the NFL, in the CFL. It was a short playing career that led him very quickly to a coaching career in the NFL, initially as an assistant, eventually as a defensive backs coach with the Baltimore Ravens and Houston Texans. And then, as we said, made that transition to college football coaching with UCLA, moving on to USC. And a lot of what we're hearing right now, guys, before I throw it to Daniel for some of his thoughts on this, is that a buyout is a key topic of conversation with Danton Lynn, with Penn State, with USC. But there are other suitors involved. We've had some conversations with people at the national level, at the local level, and out in Los Angeles, and they made it clear that Penn State's not the only hat on the table, if we want to go with the recruiting analogy right now that Lynn is considering. Now, Penn State did certainly make some moves last year when they were looking for their next defensive coordinator. Tom Allen went to Clemson. Lynn was a guy that they really knocked on that door pretty hard. He ultimately was able to get a really nice contract situation from USC. He's one of the higher paid defensive coordinators across the country. But there is a sense right now, based on people I've talked to, especially those who are out there in LA and pretty well connected with the USC program, there is some doubt building that he is going to be the Trojans' defensive coordinator in 2026. That doesn't mean he's going to be Penn State's defensive coordinator next year, but seems like there's a few things on the table that are enticing to him. Still believe that if this buyout piece can get taken care of on Penn State's end and with these conversations, that may be the most likely destination. We'll see. We'll keep monitoring this. We'll keep having conversations. Lions247.com is where you're going to find all that context and those updates. But Daniel, look, now that I've given the 2-minute, 3-minute summary of where things stand with Danton Lynn based on our reporting, what intrigues you most about this potential move for Penn State?
Yeah, I think that this is one of those names that comes up where you go like, oh, yeah, like this would be exciting. This would move the needle a little bit. He's got the proven track record of what he did out in LA with both UCLA and USC. I think in some ways there are some, with the conversation about Lynn, there are some parallels to the Matt Campbell hire where, people look at what Matt Campbell did at Iowa State and they say, oh, well, he only won, so many games. He didn't win these games. He didn't do this. And with Lynn, you see people bringing up, well, his defenses were only ranked this, they were only ranked that. But you put it within the context of what he was brought in to fix and the situation that the Trojans were in before he got there. And he's done a very, very nice job. They've got some talent. He's been able to coach it up, some scheme stuff. Obviously not perfect because USC is also on the outside looking in of the college football playoff, like a lot of teams right now. But I think that he's someone that, would bring upside with him. I think also when you look at the profile of this staff that Matt Campbell is putting together, you've got a lot of younger guys Coaches who are, might have a lot of experience, aren't necessarily early in their career, but are younger, on the younger side. And to me, that is also intriguing when you talk about, energy, culture, all those sorts of things. Helps that he's a letterman. Mark Brennan's been sharing some photos from his extensive Brennan Cam archives of Lynn as a player, and and even as a recruit.
Mhm.
So to me, that would be the name that you're kind of like, oh yeah, like this makes a sense for a lot of different reasons, and I think would be high upside for Penn State.
You mentioned the age. He's only 36 years old. I believe he started coaching in the NFL right around 24 years old, got into it very early in his life compared to a lot of the coaches that we discuss here on the show, especially former players. And he, again, just to kind of reiterate what Daniel just told everybody, USC was outside of the top 100 in points allowed per game, in rushing yards allowed, and passing yards allowed, all outside the top 100 in 2023, which is when they fired Alex Grinch as their head coach. And Danton Lynn came in last year, number 56 nationally in points allowed per game. They were number 77th nationally in yards allowed per game. This year, they're up to 47 in both of those categories. They gave up about 22.5 points per game, 348 total yards per game. So again, you're seeing that incremental improvement from what was a really rough situation. And to be honest with you, I think one of the things that people are generally look as a blemish with Lincoln Riley as a head coach is the defensive performance under his watch throughout his different tenures here. And then that's been a bit of an issue at USC, although we have seen Danton Lynn improve that situation and get rewarded financially for it. But Tyler, I'm curious from your perspective, Lynn is a guy that to me would really move the needle as a recruiter. And you just saw USC sign the number 1 class in college football. Not sure how much you might be able to kind of pry away from that group if Lynn were to end up in Happy Valley. But generally speaking, what do you kind of forecast that if Penn State were to pull things off, get the letterman back in the building, how that could play out on the trail?
It could help a little bit of juice. You've got the letterman aspect of it. I think that does matter. That carries weight. It's a guy who plays at Penn State, and we all know those guys who play at Penn State and is sent to the collegiate coaching ranks. They're some of the best at selling Penn State on the recruiting trail. They know what it's like to be in part of the program day in, day out, albeit under a different coaching staff, but that doesn't matter. They know what it means to be a Penn State Nittany Lion, and that's a message that tends to resonate pretty well with prospects. I don't think Lynn necessarily has any sort of reputation as a monster recruiter, but by no means is he a zero on the trail. He's not bad on the trail at all. He's one of those guys who kind of falls into the realm where he's big on campus, breaking down scheme fit, where exactly a guy fits in his vision for a defense. So I think it would be a hire that aligns with what Matt Campbell has been trying to do here at Penn State. A multifaceted coach who can make an impact in the X's and O's, and he can make an impact on the trail when asked to do so as well. So if it were to come together in that manner, I would like the move for Penn State. I think it would just bolster an already really, really strong coaching staff I think Matt Campbell has built here.
Yeah, I don't think we really know what his ceiling is in the recruiting trail yet. I mean, he's got 3 cycles to work with. One of them, he came in a bit late with UCLA. Then he moves over to USC pretty quickly. And so it's not like he's had a sustained run of figuring out who he is as a recruiter. And also he's been out in Los Angeles, which is a hotbed, obviously, for recruiting. But you're curious to see what that looks like here in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast region with Lynn, if he were to sink his teeth into this job. I know some people believe that he may be someone who ends up back in the NFL coaching ranks before long. His father has been a mainstay on NFL staffs for a long time, Anthony Lynn, including a stint as the head coach of the Chargers. He's been the coordinator for different teams. So a lot of pedigree, I guess you could say, when it comes to Lynn. And we'll continue monitoring this. I don't want to spend much time longer on this, considering at this point it's just conversation. If something becomes more concrete, you better believe we'll get back with the podcast and have a more hardcore discussion about Danton Lynn. We'll bring in someone from USC's then as well to provide perspective. But for now, that's what we have. And there's more coming to Lions247.com as we get more notice on what's happening with Lynn and Penn State and the other pieces involved. But as the coaching staff continues to take form, we have some official hires that have been made for Penn State. These are a couple names that we discussed early in the week when we had Tyler Cavaruso and national recruiting analyst Alan True on the show. Noah Pauley is the new receivers coach for Penn State. Jake Waters is the new quarterbacks coach. Both of them make the move from Iowa State. They're the latest to transition from Ames to State College following Matt Campbell over the last couple of weeks. And Tyler, going back to you, the recruiting ramifications. Remind us of Pauly, what he has accomplished and what you think he could accomplish in a room at receiver where there is a lot of room for growth, obviously, here in State College. And then Jake Waters, what can he do for them at quarterback based on what you've gathered?
When you talk about pedigree, I mean, Noah Pauly has it on the developmental front, developing Christian Watson into a second-round pick at North Dakota State, churning out a pair of 1,000-yard receivers at Iowa State, both of whom play for the Houston Texans now. We're second- and third-round draft picks. So developmentally, he's got a ton to sell, and that's crucial for Penn State. I think he gives Penn State a much-needed boost in that realm on the recruiting trail, because you're not selling hopes and dreams with Noah Pauly, right? You're selling tangible production, guys who have taken their game to the next level under his watch. Lack of wide receiver development was a sticking point for a lot of the top wide receivers in the country when it came to considering Penn State. It just, in recent years, it just hasn't been a place where recruits have looked at the Nittany Lions and said, all right, under that staff, in that system, in that setting, I could really take my game to the next level and thrive and become a draft pick and a high-level wide receiver in the pros one day. That's not a slight at Marcus Higgins, because, I mean, nobody in that position room has a bad word to say about Marcus Higgins, but results are results, right? And the results have been blatantly lacking. Pauly gives Penn State an elite developer of talent on the field. Off the field, he is going to parlay that into success on the recruiting trail, because it just opens the door for guys who place more of an emphasis on the developmental angle, guys who were liking Penn State. But again, there was a hurdle that they needed to clear, and it was going to be a tough hurdle for certain guys to clear under the old staff. Now Pauly's running the show as the wide receivers coach. He hit the ground running on the recruiting trail. His first offer was out to Matthew Gregory, who's an elite in-state wide receiver in the 2027 class. He's been doing a bunch of moving and shaking. So it's going to be very interesting to see which guys make it out to campus throughout junior days in the winter and then spring practice sessions, and then which ones lock in official visits, because that'll be the telltale sign of how Pauly's developmental track record and overall pitch has gone over with some of these guys. I like the hire from a recruiting perspective. I think it's a really strong move. The other thing I want to touch on here is think about what Noah Pauly has accomplished at places like North Dakota State, Iowa State as a recruiter. Now you combine his developmental ability with the Penn State brand, bigger backing, brand-wise and financially, when you factor in NIL and rev share. The possibilities for him as a recruiter, you don't want to say they're endless, but I think his ceiling is definitely as high as it has ever been from a recruiting standpoint.
Tyler, I'll come back to you again with Waters, the new quarterbacks coach. But I want to go over to Daniel, because he had the stories up for us. He had some pre-writes ready for a while, and when Pauly came up, he was ready to fire the trigger on that one. Daniel, what stands out about this move? I mean, we've talked about it. It's been a long while since people viewed Penn State and thought, receivers making big plays down the field, splash pass plays aside from Tyler Warren. What stands out to you about Pauly?
Yeah, I think Tyler did a really nice job of running down everything that he brings to the table. But I think that development piece is really that really stands out to me. You look at what he did with Jalen Knoll and Jaden Higgins last year. Neither of them were pretty highly rated, I think, both on the recruiting trail or coming out of the transfer portal. And he was really able to elevate their games. And I think that's really, really what you're looking for. I know that it's easy to get caught up in the stars and everything like that. And we do know that there's a very real correlation between bringing a lot of highly rated guys in and seeing results on the field. But at the same time, you look at some of the more highly rated wide receiver recruits Penn State has gotten the past few years, and it hasn't really mattered. You haven't seen contributions from some of the top 247 guys who were brought to campus. So if you're Pauly and you can, get the most out of these guys who are going to be in your room, I think also projecting forward, it's a little tough because we have no idea who's sticking around right now. But I think that, if you were to take the room that's there right now, guys with remaining eligibility, look at the younger guys, and the idea of pairing someone like a Kobe Howard with Noah Pauly, I think that your mind starts to go places. Then you think about, maybe someone like a Jeff Exner Jr. or a Lyric Samuel, someone who is, maybe a little bit more raw or maybe a little bit more unique in what they bring to the table. The idea of having someone who, has developed these different types of wide receivers. I think that your imagination can run a little bit with that. Obviously, who knows if any of those guys are going to be around to actually get coached by Pauly. But I think that if you're trying to figure out what's next and you're in the room, this guy brings a really good track record in there too. He was the Football Scoop wide receivers coach of the year last year. You think about that. And then, Taylor Mauser, the OC, he was the Football Scoop tight ends coach of the year this year. So I think that it shows that Matt Campbell has, identified talent, brought it in, and they've been able to thrive. And it's like you said, I mean, there's this whole thing where it's like the scaling up, where it's, okay, they did all this stuff at Iowa State. Now let's see what they can do with Penn State. And I think that there's a lot of excitement in terms of these guys coming over for those reasons.
I think you're right with guys like Kobe Howard. And I think he's the priority name there in the receiver room, because those 3 transfers that you brought in last offseason are senior eligible. So this is the end for them. But it's a double-pronged approach, right? You got to present a competitive NIL package that financially, wets the beak, but you also need to have a compelling option of the guy they're going to be working with and trusting in that position room. And Pauly's resume certainly speaks for itself, and that should help in some of these conversations, I'd imagine. And Tyler, before we get into what Pauly can do in the 2027 cycle, or maybe adding some late 2026 talent, or even recruiting guys who are already on campus, I think the transfer portal is going to be the ultimate indication of kind of the cachet he maybe carries right now in this room as wide receivers coach. It's going to have to be an aggressive, few weeks for Penn State. We've seen aggressive approach from them in the past at receiver. We haven't really seen the development come through on the other side of it, where guys come to campus and improve. Guys have typically come to a campus and they've seen their numbers slip. But this January, we got 2 weeks until the portal opens. How key is this going to be with Pauly leading the way at wide receiver? And what is your anticipation for how active Penn State intends to be there?
Probably opens the door for guys who are looking for something ready-made. What I mean by that is they know they could go and work with the wide receivers coach who has that developmental track record, and they know that there's a pretty good chance Noah Pauly will get them right during their time with the program. So I think that adds an added layer of appeal that Penn State probably did not have working for it in the portal in wide receiver recruiting. I expect it to be a position that they're active. I think they're going to explore avenues to get more dynamic and explosive at the position. I feel like a broken record saying that. I feel like I've been saying that the last 3 off seasons, or however many off seasons it's been. But I think more so now than ever, they have a chance to actually achieve that, just because of Pauly himself. And I think the offense is also going to appeal to wide receivers as well, because, again, Taylor Mauser, Matt Campbell, they have the reputation of running a system where it plays to the strengths of their personnel. They work with the guys that they have, and they go after a certain type, and they make the most of those players' ability. So, Pauly, track record, 2 1,000-yard receivers. I come back to that because that is going to be an initial big selling point. Receivers are going to see that and be like, oh, wow, he got them there. Those were portal guys as well. Let me see if I could go work with him and get to that next level in my own right. So it's a position I expect them to be active at, or at least explore at the bare minimum. And Pauly's going to be a big, big boost in those potential pursuits for sure.
If you're hearing some chains in the background when Tyler talks and you're maybe listening and wondering, is he doing like the Jacob Marley impersonation? Is he doing his Christmas Carol rendition? There's a dog in the background who we love. And that's just the situation there. It's okay.
Wait till he starts barking at something he sees outside. We'll see how much we love him then.
Daniel, another guy that you had that story ready for and wrote for us at Lions247.com when it became official is Jake Waters, quarterback's coach, coming over from Iowa State. Again, we'll see if his quarterback follows him from Iowa State, and Rocco Beck. That's been a topic of conversation the last couple of weeks. But what do we need to know in terms of background and path to Happy Valley for Waters?
Yeah, I think this one is a little bit of a fun one for Penn State fans of a certain age. It was before my time, but back in fall 2012, Bill O'Brien was recruiting Jake Waters heavily out of Iowa Western Community College to come in and be the Penn State coach and or Penn State quarterback. And it seems like that they felt pretty good that they were going to get Jake Waters. And who knows what the trajectory of things look like when you talk about having Christian Hackenberg in the fold and, all of your sliding doors, dominoes, whatever you want to, however you want to phrase it. But then at the 11th hour, Jake Waters goes to Kansas State and has 2 successful years. And, ever since then, he's been on the coaching path. He spent 6 of the past 9 years, with Matt Campbell. He spent the past 5 years in Ames. I think the past 3 years he was the quarterbacks coach, where he got to work with Rocco Becht. Before that, when he was on staff, he still got to work with Brock Purdy. He's someone who has, I think, a pretty unique background. Given his junior college experience, he coached wide receivers and some other positions at UTEP for a couple of years, which, that is a little bit of a college football outpost. And so I think that you're bringing in someone who has some different views, some different experiences, and you hope that you can apply that to the Penn State quarterbacks, whoever they are. Next year, with the movement that we think is coming. I think that, again, I think Jake Waters is 33. I couldn't find an exact age for Noah Pauley, but I think he's in that 36, 37 range. These are a ton of guys who, are on the younger side. I think that there's a lot of upside, with the staff, especially when you factor in the resources and talent that they have at Penn State. And I think that, Waters is going to be in the spotlight, especially when you consider how things have gone with quarterback development over the past couple of years. We know that James Franklin was a huge Danny O'Brien fan. He's at Virginia Tech, with Franklin now. And you're subbing in another, I think, younger former college quarterback with a lot of experience that can relate to these guys. And I think that that's a bonus in there too. Of course, easy to talk about these things now, but we'll see in September, October, November, what you're actually getting out of your quarterback, how this development is actually going.
As someone who is in their mid-30s, veering toward late 30s, I love that you keep calling this age group young. Keep at it, Daniel. Thank you.
I mean, it's for me too. Don't worry.
That's right. But when we look at the talent acquisition angle for Waters, Tyler, I think Daniel laid it out pretty good there. It's been a path up the ladder for college football for him, and that goes for a lot of the new guys who've come over from Iowa State, including Matt Campbell. This will be the biggest stage they have been on as coaches, as leaders, as recruiters. And so when it comes to adding talent to this quarterback room, and I think it's fair to say right now that beyond Ethan Grunkemeyer, who has this 7-game sample size that he's going to finish the season with, you don't know much. Jackson Small's been injured and unavailable a couple different times in his career. He hasn't played other times, so we don't know much about him. He'll be on his 4th year of eligibility next year. Beckham Kritza, very much known as a project, wasn't available for 10 of the 12 games this regular season. You're bringing in a couple quarterbacks, one of which is another project type in Peyton Falzone here from the state of Pennsylvania. So he's got his 2026 quarterback following him from Iowa State. What stands out generally, you think, and what needs to be done in this room, what he has kind of ahead of him in the challenge of restarting, maybe resetting things at the QB spot?
Might not have the same reputation as Paulie on the developmental front, but he's also regarded as a strong developer of talent. That's going to be big for Penn State at the position. My early feedback, just a really great guy overall that kids enjoy being around, being part of this quarterback room, and that's going to help Penn State on the recruiting trail. Similarly to Paulie, I mean, he hit the ground running on the trail. His first offer was to Peter Bork, who top 100 quarterback in the 27 class, committed to Michigan. We all know what's going on in Michigan right now, so Penn State is keeping an eye on that situation. I think Bort's keeping an eye on the Nittany Lions at this point. So Waters is trying to make his mark early. I'm going to be very interested to see how they balance high school recruiting and portal recruiting as they go about rebuilding this quarterback room. Because you're right, when you walk into a new situation like this where there's essentially a complete coaching staff overhaul, you have to evaluate every position group, quarterback at the top of the list. Do the traits of the players in that room fit the offense that you want to run? Are there long-term fits in that quarterback room? If there aren't, there are tough conversations that have to be had. But bringing in a guy like Case Evans from that 26 Iowa State signing class, I believe is a pretty good start. Obviously, that was a move that went down way before Waters was officially announced. by Penn State, but he has a lot of solid traits that Water has shown he can develop. So it's an intriguing add to the staff. I like the move. And also, before I end my tangent on Waters, Dan, to go back to your point, I don't know how old Noah Pauley is either, but in 2024, he attended a 35 under 35, some 35 under 35 coaching seminar. I don't know where that puts him on the age scale, but there's some more context for that.
You can't accuse our guys at Lions 24/7 of not lifting up the rocks and looking underneath them, trying to get answers. That's what we do around here. Good stuff from you, Tyler. In terms of the staff, there are, again, moving parts, and there's guys who are here that won't be here in a couple weeks, and there's guys who've already left, and there's guys who are here, but they're kind of working behind the scenes because they're not really coaching on the field quite yet. And with all that in mind, we got some perspective from Terry Smith, who said, we're operating in an unorthodox area. That's the way he phrased it when I asked him about trying to game plan for Clemson while dealing with all the staff movement. And we heard from Terry Smith in a press conference setting on Thursday. We were able to ask a couple questions, Daniel and I. And one of the things that he discussed was, yes, Phil Trautwein is here coaching. Marcus Hagans is here coaching. Andy Kotelnicki is here coaching. Now, Trautwein is the guy who has a destination. If you've been following him on Twitter, it's been kind of a weird dichotomy where he's tweeting some Penn State stuff and then he's tweeting some Florida Gators stuff. And you've got recruits already basically being like, thanks to Phil Trautwein for the Florida Gators offer. He's going back to his alma mater. Great opportunity for him moving forward after 6 years at Penn State. But he's here working with the Pinstripe Bowl. I think you can probably apply that somewhat to Stan Drayton, although he hasn't been here as long and he's not going to his alma mater. He also has a next destination. He's been introduced as South Carolina's next running backs coach, but he is here preparing the team for the Pinstripe Bowl. Marcus Hagans, as we talked about, Noah Pauley is going to be the wide receivers coach here. That means he is not going to be the wide receivers coach here. And as Daniel referenced earlier, Taylor Mauser, who's going to be the tight ends coach and the offensive coordinator, he'll be your play caller in 2026. But to finish out 2025 and to finish out his second season with the Nittany Lions, Andy Kotelnicki remains the offensive coordinator for Penn State. So there's a lot of things happening right now. And Daniel, I think it's fair to give some props if they get out to Yankee Stadium on Saturday, December 27th, and look like a unit for 4 quarters that was prepared to play in that game, and they challenge Clemson or they beat Clemson. Terry Smith, again, he deserves another feather in his cap. And also from a professional acumen standpoint, so do guys like Trautwein, Hagans, Kotelnicki, and Drayton, because this is a very strange period for all of them.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique situation. And I think that there's a lot of different ways that things could have gone. Granted, there's still another week, to before this game in terms of, roster movement and other movement that, can still shake out in a couple different ways. But yeah, I mean, I think that, you look at, what the job is, and, the job is to win football games. And I think that, some of these situations, they were, able to look at things and work things out. It was kind of funny, seeing Phil Trautwein, immediately change his avatar on Twitter to him as a Gators player, and, start seeing those offers go out, and, some familiar names popping up there. I think at least one former Penn State commit, and, guys that he's offering, when they tweet out the offer, they're putting pictures of Phil Trautwein, in their offer instead of the, normal, I guess, Google, first Florida Gator player to pop up, put him in there. So it's a funny situation. But I do think that, Terry Smith has shown that I think he's the right guy for a unique situation. The job that he did stepping in, and I think putting out what the standard was going to be through the back half of the season, getting guys to rise and meet that. From what he said on Thursday, sounds like he's offering a similar thing to the coaches, to the players, about the level that they want to play at, and the fact that they want to go to win. I know that there's a lot of there's probably some people that want to sim to the end. They want the new staff to be in place. They want Marcus Hagans to be gone. They want Andy Kotelnicki to be gone. All these things, but you got to get to the finish line. And there are some real things that you have to do. And I think that if you can put these people together and put this team together, get it to perform well. I think that's a really good reflection on these guys as they go and try to find a new job or go to their new destination. So, everyone's still got jobs to do. And it seems like that, the way Terry Smith is going about it, he's got these guys focused in and, they're going to get this thing to the finish line.
And they all have professional pride. I mean, at noon, the Saturday after Christmas, there's going to be some eyeballs in the game when it's Penn State versus Clemson. These are two teams that were in the preseason top 5 just a few months ago. And so no one wants to be embarrassed in that kind of a stage, in that kind of a setting, regardless of what's happening after the matchup. And Tyler, those names that I just mentioned that are still here but nearing the exit door, Phil Troutwine, Stan Drayton, Marcus Higgins, Andy Kotelnicki, which of them do you think, which of those departures impacts Penn State's recruiting the most?
Probably Troutwine. I think the most tangible results definitely came from Phil Troutwine. Over the last few cycles, really, if Phil Troutwine wanted a guy, more often than not, he went out and got him. There was a high hit rate for Phil Troutwine when it came to guys that he had high on his board early in the cycle. And we saw him recruit to a certain type as well. Guys like Owen Alasine, big athletic tackles who are still coming into their own, have high ceilings. So you saw some big recruiting wins. I mean, 5-star Malachi Goodman was a big recruiting win for Phil Troutwine and the Penn State staff. So really for him, that's probably the biggest loss. I mean, it was hit or miss with Marcus Higgins. We spent a lot of last summer talking about some misses on the trail. He rebounded nicely to help flip Matthew out and late in the 2025 cycle, but there were some recruitments that could have gone Penn State's way that ultimately did not go Penn State's way. And then Andy Kotelnicki, I mean, I've touched on it. They stopped sending their coordinators out on the trail in recent years. So a lot of his impact came on campus, similarly to Jim Knowles. I mean, we know Andy Kotelnicki's a charismatic guy, so he was liked by recruits. But when it comes to the biggest departure, I can't really factor Stan Drayton into the conversations because he wasn't around long enough. And I think his biggest impact on the trail was keeping Messiah Mickens committed for as long as possible. And the same deal with Kamon Spell. Until it hit the fan, those guys, they were committed and they liked Stan Drayton. They had nothing but good things to say about Stan Drayton. So it's just too small of a sample size for me to seriously factor him into the conversation. So Phil Troutwine is my choice for that conversation for sure.
I had to laugh because I was thinking in my head, I'm like, did Stan Drayton ever actually pick up a commitment here? And no, he didn't. He reserved some commitments for a while until James Franklin was fired, as you mentioned, and things hit the fan. But yeah, that's an interesting note from you. And Stan Drayton, I'm curious to see what he does at South Carolina if he sticks there for a bit. He's a guy that feels like we hardly got to know him here from being Temple's head coach to being Penn State's running backs coach, and now moving on. A couple guys who started this season and spent most of the season as assistant position coaches are now in position coach roles temporarily leading up to the Pinstripe Bowl. That includes Trace McSorley at quarterback because you've got Danny O'Brien moving on and following James Franklin to Virginia Tech. Ty Howell did the same thing out of the tight end spot. He's going to be an offensive coordinator for Virginia Tech. He has moved on to Blacksburg. And so you have Bill Quizert. And I know Quizert isn't a name that people are super familiar with, but he came over with Andy Kotelnicki from Kansas a couple of years ago, ended up working alongside Phil Troutwine for much of his stay here at Happy Valley. He's shifting over, coaching up the tight ends for the Pinstripe Bowl. And Jordan Lucas remains the cornerbacks coach as Terry Smith created an absence there by becoming the interim coach. And so the thing here is, Daniel, look, I don't know. I mean, Jordan Lucas, I think, being a letterman, a guy who clearly loves Terry Smith. Terry Smith's not going anywhere. Maybe Jordan Lucas is here in some kind of capacity next year. I think we're still wondering on Trace McSorley and very much wondering on Quizert, considering he was a guy that was kind of came as luggage with Andy Kotelnicki, and Andy Kotelnicki is now leaving. Trace McSorley, though, a guy that is beloved in the Nittany Lions football community, has done good work behind the scenes as far as we can gather it. He has an opportunity here. And we heard from Ethan Grunkemeyer this week that he feels like Trace McSorley has done a good job of stabilizing things and really taking advantage of this moment for him in his young coaching career. But these guys all face uncertainty. And unlike the names we've mentioned before, they have not yet reached the threshold where they're making 600, 700, 800 into the high thousands, into the millions. They are still relatively early on their path and trying to become power conference coaches. And so this is a nice opportunity for them, whether or not they end up sticking the landing in State College or elsewhere.
Yeah, I think you really look at McSorley in the situation. I mean, obviously he has the biggest name recognition of any of these guys, but we heard about it from James Franklin and from Danny O'Brien that they'd been talking to him about, okay, like when the NFL thing runs out, like, do you want to coach? Do you want to come back here? I talked to him at an NIL event back in May. And he had a baby in July. He and his wife were excited to, after the nomadic NFL life, they were excited to put down roots, live in a place that they were familiar. And I think a lot of people looked at the Penn State program as a bastion of stability under James Franklin. And so I think that there was some long game in terms of McSorley, coming back to Penn State. But it'll be interesting to see, how these roles shake out. I know that was a really big thing under Franklin, was increasing the number of analysts that they had on staff. And then the timing of expanding those staffs worked out really nicely when the NCAA relaxed the regulations about countable coaches. So someone like Danny O'Brien, who was an analyst, someone like Dan Connor, who was an analyst, they could become on-field coaches. I think there was a point over the summer where in the staff directory, they changed all of the analyst titles, to different, like assistant position coaches and things like that. And so that's something that I think we're going to learn about with Matt Campbell is, how big is he going to build this staff out? What kind of resources are they going to put into that part of it? We know that from the reports that he has a pretty big staff pool available to him. So it'll be interesting to watch moving forward, because I think, with McSorley, wouldn't be a surprise to see him be that assistant QB's coach again next year. Wouldn't be a surprise to see Jordan Lucas, have a, assistant cornerbacks coach title again. We heard how, locked in he was with Terry Smith, last month going, as the season was winding down. He seems like that. It's one of those things where Terry Smith sticking around seems like it, heightens the chances of other guys with Penn State ties sticking around. Then with Queeser, I think that he was that's an Andy Kotelnicki guy. So we'll see where Kotelnicki goes and how those things work out.
McSorley, 30 years old now, and Terry Smith told us earlier this year, before he became the interim head coach, about McSorley, quote, "It's a blessing to have him in the building." And so we'll see if they continue to have him in the building beyond the Pinstripe Bowl. I also wonder if James Franklin grabs the conch shell and blows on it, because he had Trace McSorley follow him from that Vanderbilt recruiting class many years ago. And much has changed here. Trace has some significant roots here in State College and is growing a family here, a very young family. And so some things to consider there. And just, again, a lot of staff notes we wanted to pass along that became clear to us here in the last couple of days. We were lacking clarity about where this coaching staff really was heading into the Pinstripe Bowl. And Anthony Poindexter, by the way, for the third time in 5 seasons, will be your defensive play caller in a postseason game. He did that back in the Outback Bowl to finish off the 2021 season when Brent Pry went to Virginia Tech, and he did that to finish off the 2023 campaign when Manny Diaz left before the Peach Bowl game to head down and be Duke's head coach. So Poindexter will get that opportunity again. And Tyler, I think it's really a bit kind of confusing on how things are going to play out in that secondary for the coaching situation, because look, Terry Smith, we haven't gotten an answer on what his defined role will be on the field next year, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But we do know that ISU safeties coach Dion Broomfield is coming to Happy Valley. He's another one of those former Cyclones assistant coaches under Matt Campbell. We're going to continue to work for Campbell with the new team. And Broomfield, again, was the safeties coach the last few years. It's tricky to see where this all leaves Anthony Poindexter, a guy who we've always wondered, does he want to go out and become a full-time defensive coordinator somewhere? He's gotten interviews as a head coach before. He is a All-American. He is a college football Hall of Famer. He is a Super Bowl champion. He has accomplished a lot in his career. And to me, he's been kind of part of the fabric of what they have done culturally and on the recruiting trail. And so beyond this moment for Poindexter, when he gets another chance to call some plays against the quality offense again Clemson, this is one that I think is really interesting to follow moving forward for a lot of reasons, including roster building.
Yeah, it's probably the biggest coaching question mark, as Matt Campbell builds this staff out, other than who the running backs coach is going to be. I think those two are up there on the question mark list. Poindexter, his track record is impressive, right? Like he's a guy, ideally, no matter where he lands, you think he's going to be coaching at a high level. I don't know if that's going to be at Penn State because, like you said, Deion Broomfield worked with the safeties at Ohio State. It sounds like he's going to reprise that role in State College. You have to factor in Terry Smith being retained by Matt Campbell on this staff. We all know Terry Smith's work with cornerbacks. If that's where he winds up slotting in addition to his associate head coach position, where does that leave Anthony Poindexter when it's all said and done? I don't know. I think there's a lot up in the air right now. Could Broomfield slide to corners? Poindexter sticks at safeties. Terry Smith works with another group or just really hangs around as associate head coach? I don't know. That's not something I think is likely in this scenario, but it's very up in the air with Anthony Poindexter. And this is it for Anthony Poindexter. I mean, he did some really great work for Penn State on the recruiting trail. The safety position was consistently a strength for Penn State with Anthony Poindexter on the staff. And if you want one example for me, Anthony Poindexter as a recruiter and his strengths as a person, look no further than King Mack coming back this year. No bridges were burned when King Mack left for Alabama, and not every position coach, unfortunately, maintains that level of maturity when a guy decides to depart the program. You know, in this industry, not burning bridges is very important. And Anthony Poindexter, I don't think has ever burned a bridge in his coaching career, especially as a recruiter. He's a hell of a guy, great coach. So we'll see what's next for him. But if this is it for him at Penn State, if this is his last hurrah, I think a lot of people can look back on Dex's tenure and praise it. I think that's the best way to put it.
You mentioned the intrigue at running backs coach with Stan Drayton moving on to the SEC. We think a name to monitor there is Elijah Brooks,
Yes.
who's been on Virginia Tech's coaching staff. He will not be part of James Franklin's coaching staff in Blacksburg. Spent the last couple of seasons at Virginia Tech, 3 of them, in fact, and before that, a few seasons as Maryland's running backs coach. He really made his mark nationally as a guy who was leading the DeMatha Catholic program there in Daniel's beloved DMV region, producing a ton of power conference talent on a year-by-year basis. So just a name to maybe keep in your back pocket there as Penn State continues to sort through what they want to do in completing their 2026 staff. Look, Terry Smith's role is interesting as well, Daniel. As I referenced, we know he's going to be the associate head coach moving forward. That's what he was under James Franklin, essentially the top lieutenant in the building, the top assistant in the building, and he's going to be one of the highest paid non-coordinator or head coaches across college football. Something that Pat Kraft had to get done keeping him here in terms of roster retention and keeping a lot of people satisfied with how the coaching search was going to finish. They got that done. But he was pretty coy with us in this media session. He pointed to early January for when official titles will come out. John Sauber of the Center Daily Times asked him, what position would you be comfortable coaching? This is a guy who played wide receiver for Penn State, coached cornerbacks for 11 and a half seasons. He went on to list every single position, including kickers, long snappers, linebackers, offensive line, said it all with a smile as well. Daniel, he's having some fun with this. And I think now the fact that the campaign for the job and all that is settled, he's now settling back into being a guy who's going to do what he can for this program. And what do you make ultimately of what's next and Terry Smith's part of this next era for Penn State football?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're waiting for some of these moving parts to, settle. I think you're, waiting, maybe the defensive coordinator that gets into place. Then there's a trickle down of, okay, this is who, maybe there's guys the new DC wants to bring with him or wants to bring in, to be on his defensive staff. I think that you just have to wait for these different puzzle pieces to fall in. And then you can start putting the labels on it. Every release that Penn State sends out after another, coaching edition, it, says that the titles are subject to change. And you look at Deion Broomfield, he has the secondary coach title. I think that, I don't know if that will be permanent or not. Maybe there will be a distinction, when it comes to, safeties versus cornerbacks. I mean, Penn State, they had, the special teams coordinator had the Nichols coach title. Like you can really, play around with these in some different ways, with titles, something I also touched on earlier, the accountable coaches thing, relaxing that. I think that gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of, who you have on staff, who you have on the field, doing different coaching. So, I think that, a lot of people, right now, I think they want to know, like, all right, what is Terry Smith's position going to be? What is this full staff going to look like? And we just don't necessarily know right now. That you've still got some balls in the air. You've got to, figure a couple things out. There's going to be a ripple effect when you make that DC hire, because that is, on that side of the ball, that is top of the food chain. I don't think Matt Campbell has explicitly said the DC is the head coach of the defense, like we've heard in the past, but that's someone who is going to have some power, is going to have some weight to throw around in terms of how he wants to do things, how he wants to organize his staff. And I think that you have to wait for some of these things to happen. And, I, appreciated Terry Smith given, saying that, like, January, like we'll see, things will, the labels will be settled. Everything will be, I think, worked out then.
Terry said he had a couple meetings in recent days where one was with the staff, one was with the players. We already covered the staff angle of this, but he said you're either in or you're out for this Pinstripe Bowl prep. He doesn't want anybody with one foot on the bandwagon, 1 foot off. And one guy that we know is out of the equation is Chaz Coleman now, as he announced plans to enter the transfer portal on Thursday. Probably the buzziest name among players in preseason camp, freshman or veterans. He was the guy that was just generating a lot of conversation among the coaching staff, among players, among us in the media. You heard it here on the podcast. You saw it in our reporting at Lions 24/7. That really carried over into non-conference play, where he flashed with some plays, had a strip sack that he almost returned for a fumble. There were moments where you said, yeah, I can see the athletic traits. You can see why it was showing up on the field, but much quieter come Big Ten action. Part of that was less of a role, less reps. Part of it was that he was sidelined for a span. One time when he was sick in October, another time when he had an injury issue that kept him out of a few games in November. He did get back late in the season to the practice field. Ultimately, though, this is a guy that we have been talking about for a while. Will he stay? Won't he stay? Is Penn State going to keep him? Right now, he is looking elsewhere, and he announced that on Thursday. The portal won't open until January, but he debuted at number 1 in 24/7 Sports transfer rankings. They're going to change a lot. There's going to be a lot of players from college football playoff teams and different parts of the country who enter this thing in the coming weeks, but that speaks very highly. And we'll have a story at Lions 24/7 because I'm catching up with the guy who sets these rankings for us at 24/7 Sports, Cooper Patagna, who has worked in multiple power conference recruiting offices. But Tyler, you were blowing the horn on Chaz Coleman as early as I heard anyone doing it. I think last June, when he was just getting to camp in the summer, you threw him in there among your most impact freshmen when we did not. So how do you view the impact of this loss?
Production versus potential, right? I think that's how I look at it, because Chaz Coleman flashed several times as a true freshman. No doubt about it. Nobody can argue that. That being said, he still has things to work on. I know Chaz Coleman has the potential to be an elite pass rusher in college and maybe even the NFL. He has all the athleticism that you could ask for. His ceiling is right up there next to Yvonne Kamaju's, as high as any defensive lineman Penn State brought in during the 25 recruiting cycle. Could argue Coleman's is even higher just because of the raw elite athleticism that he possesses. But that being said,
let's be honest, the trait of getting to the quarterback is one of the most coveted commodities at every level of football. You see it reflected in NFL salaries. You see it reflected in recruit rankings. That is something you need to be able to do to win games, to win championships, is put the quarterback on his ass. And that's what Coleman is viewed as, being a guy who can do that routinely as he develops.
That's right. A player like Chaz Coleman is going to be at a premium in the portal because he immense upside. He still has things he needs to work on. There are instances, and again, we just talked about his strengths as a pass rusher. He's got to get better against the run. He has to continue getting stronger, because if he doesn't get better against the run, the fact of the matter is that pigeonholes him into a position where he's kind of just a situational pass rusher, and then that sky-high ceiling that we're talking about, it collapses a little bit. But I love the kid. I think he's going to be a really good college football player and probably get to the NFL. I think he's got that in him. I've talked to plenty of people who agree with that assessment. There are still boxes that need to be checked off in the developmental process and all that good stuff. I think he'll get there. So it's a loss. It's not – I wouldn't classify it as some massive Matt Campbell L like some people are portraying on social media. Because, I mean, social media portrayals, they're just the most accurate things ever, right, guys? I mean, Penn State worked to keep Chaz Coleman on board. He just wanted to go elsewhere. He was a big James Franklin guy. You know, it's just there were certain factors involved here where hanging on to Chaz Coleman was always going to be difficult. So maybe in a few years, Penn State fans are looking at Chaz Coleman as one of those ones who got away, but he still has some work to do. I think he's probably going to get there in the end, to be completely honest with you guys. But it's a loss. It's not some massive loss that Penn State can't not overcome it. There's a path to overcome losing a guy like Chaz Coleman, but it stings, no doubt. I'm not going to sit here and say otherwise.
Yeah, and I think something else important, because there are people who are saying, well, he didn't really do much in Big Ten play this year. I mean, he had a couple moments in the Ohio State game, and then he didn't play. And so why is there this buzz? Why would he possibly be like a top-ranked transfer portal type guy based on what he's done at the college level? Let's remember, he didn't get to the college level until June. And at the high school level, he was playing quarterback. He's playing receiver. The whole point was, like, you're getting this guy in a situation where he's, you know, focusing in on being a pass rusher, going to build his body, which you have a very small window to do that when you show up on campus in June and you have preseason camp in August. So it is all about potential with Chaz Coleman. And again, that pass rush trait, we've always heard that Yavan Kamaju is ahead of him as a run defender, clearly a more balanced defensive end right now. But when you talk someone who's going to be a reliable, balanced defensive end, or someone who's going to be a high-end pass rusher that maybe has some issues covering the run, there's a conversation there that general managers will have in the NFL, that, you know, general managers here in college football will have. Which guy would you rather have? And Daniel, if Tyler got us a head start on the Coleman coverage, and I was the one who really brought it directly to the forefront with some of my coverage in August and September, you're the guy who's been telling us, let's see how it plays out against Oregon. Let's see how it plays out as Big Ten competition heats up. And you've been very measured in your approach. One, what do you make of Chaz Coleman leaving? Two, what do you think the impact is on this defensive end group? Because like Tyler said, you are losing a guy with a ceiling here, but it's not like you're losing someone who we were chalking up as a 40 snap a game player next year who was going to have 12 sacks.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't just me that was pumping the brakes. I mean, it was Jim Knowles. You know, we talked to him during the bye week, and, you know, he said that, you know, hey, you got to see it, you know, in the Big Ten. And you talk about, I know that he dealt with illness and, you know, injury stuff, but you look at those snap counts, and I think Terry Smith said it too. You know, they were playing some run-heavy teams in there, and Chaz Coleman just didn't profile, you know, as someone who, you know, they to have in their game plan there. I think overall for me, this is one of those things where it's like everything can be true when you talk about Chaz Coleman. Like, I was a little surprised to see him, you know, number one in the transfer portal rankings off the jump. But at the same time, I think that he has enormous upside, that he can really accomplish, you know, some special things as a pass rusher. I mean, you know, you could see it. And, you know, that development, you know, some things take time. At the same time, a lot of things that needed to be worked on. You know, I think the fact that, you know, he didn't play, you know, against Iowa that much, or, you know, there were games against run heavy teams where, you know, they did not use him. They did not lean on him. I think that, you know, that really does stand out. You know, I do think that, you know, to say that it's the biggest loss in the world, I think that's hyperbole. But then also to say, you know, well, he didn't produce in Big Ten play, so it's not a loss. I think that's also hyperbole. You know, I think that this really does settle somewhere in the middle with Chaz Coleman. But yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a loss for next year when you talk about, you know, someone who can affect the quarterback, someone that can make those game-changing plays. 2 years down the road, when ostensibly he'll have more time in a college strength and conditioning program, maybe can bulk up, you know, maybe can refine some of that run technique, you know, then you're potentially looking at a huge loss. You know, I just think that it's one of those things where, you know, there's some nuance to this, and you can look at it, you know, any way you want to sort of fit your narrative of things. But, you know, for people who, you know, there is a segment of people that are saying, oh, like, good riddance, you know, have fun at your next destination, wink, wink. You know, I think that that's the wrong way to look at it. You know, I think that this is someone who, you know, really could have done some special things at Penn State, and at the same time, got to get used to this new environment of college football, this new player movement where, there are going to be things where, you'll look at guys like as ones that got away when they were just out of place for 1 year, and then moved on. We know that, in the past under James Franklin, Penn State was really good, at retention and keeping guys around. I was texting with Tyler last night where I went through every CFP team roster, trying to find Penn State connections because I wanted to do maybe there's a story here. Trey Wallace is the only former Penn State player. He's on Ole Miss, and
Wow.
the only former Penn State commit. I can only find one. There's a lot of near misses, a lot of almost, a lot of guys Penn State fans would want to have, but the only guy on a CFP roster who was committed to Penn State was Derek Plaz.
He was committed for 2 weeks, by the way.
Yeah, and
I'm looking forward to your feature on Trey.
And so I'm sure our readers would love that. But yeah, so I mean, I think that this is just going to be one of those things that you have to get used to, and that is going to change. Where guys are only going to be here for a year, something's going to open up. They're going to be on the move. You might not like it. I don't necessarily like it. But until something changes, this is going to be the nature of the beast now.
I know a lot of people are viewing this as like Chaz Coleman's sitting in a tent outside of Ohio State's football facility, just waiting to walk in. I don't think it's that much of a slam dunk as some are assuming it is. I do think there's a lot to be said about the fact that he's an Ohio kid. There is Ohio State fans in his orbit, and he also got a strong push from the Buckeyes last recruiting cycle before he ultimately stuck with Penn State. But I think he would be smart, and I think he will field a lot of interest. I mean, when you're this highly ranked by 24/7 Sports, I mean, people are going to pay attention not only to that ranking, but they're going to pay attention to the buzz that was in place and the things that were said about him. And it'll be really interesting to see where he ultimately lands if it was not Ohio State. I know a lot of people are just viewing that as a layup. I don't necessarily think it's as A to B as it's being made out to be. And the defensive end spot, Tyler, we talked about wide receiver being a necessary priority again in the transfer portal. You talk about what's happening in this position right now. You lose Chaz Coleman from the equation for 2026. You're going to lose Denai Dennis Sutton to the NFL. Zariah Fisher can play a 7th year. He talked to Daniel about that during a practice Thanksgiving week. Didn't say he's definitely going to take a 7th year, but did acknowledge it's available to him because of his injury track record here at Penn State. So that's available to a starter right there, but he would be about 24 years old next year. And does he want to just kind of move on? That's a fair question. Then you've got Jalen Harvey, who will be a redshirt sophomore next year. You've got Malachi Williams, Cortez Harris, younger pieces of this roster as well. And then Max Granville, who I think is easy to forget a bit, but there was a lot of buzz about that kid, earlier this year before he suffered an injury that kept him off the field throughout the season, throughout preseason. And so he's in that mix as a 3rd-year college player, assuming he's still around. But clearly you could use some plug-and-play options at defensive end right now, and the portal would probably be where you find that.
Look, I'm glad you talked about Max Granville. If Max Granville sticks around and he is who he was before the injury, you guys know how much I loved Max Granville coming out. He might not be quite the athletic freak that Chaz Coleman is, but his ceiling's right up there as a pass rusher. And he's very, very smart kid too. He's very about his business. So if he could get back to where he was physically and he sticks around, which is something I haven't heard any buzz about him departing as of yet. We'll see as the portal season progresses because, guys are thinking one thing one week, then next week it's another thing. But if Max Granville could get back to who he was, that's kind of a portal addition in its own sense because you're getting a guy back from injury who is going to be a big part of the plans in 2025. And beyond Max Granville and the young personnel that I think is crucial to keep around and just maintaining depth at the position, they're going to be active on the edge for sure. They're active on the edge every offseason. You guys know that. It's one of those positions where you look. Bare minimum, you look. Because odds are there's a guy out there who can help you as a pass rusher or even against the run as an edge-setting defensive end in some capacity. So the scouting team works at it. The staff makes their evaluations. There's always going to be a guy or two who jump off the page as a fit for you. So I expect defensive end and on the interior as well. Those will be spots where Penn State is looking early and often just to see what's out there. They're not going to force the issue. If it's not a fit, it's not a fit. If the talent's not there, the talent's not there. But let's be real. We know what the edge rusher market looks like every transfer portal window. the talent's going to be there. So Penn State's going to be involved.
And it's going to be pricey, just like it is in the league.
Yes.
The cover position. Guys who can catch contested balls down the field, guys who can disrupt the quarterback. These are premium positions, and Penn State will not be alone. A couple names I didn't mention there that I wanted to in terms of the young cluster of defensive ends that we haven't really gotten a long look at in any capacity yet. Daniel Jennings, who reclassified from the 2026 class during the last offseason, like we saw Granville do a year before. And then Deshaun Burnett, who we liked a lot coming out of Pittsburgh's Amani Christian Academy. He's also on campus. And of course, Ivan Kamaju projects at this point as a starter in 2026 based on the way he has played, based on the way that he has gotten a lot of reps and really established himself as a formidable piece of the defensive future here at Penn State. That's only 2 guys, by the way, that we have heard are hitting the transfer portal. That is a number that will grow. I'd imagine it will probably grow within minutes or hours of the Pinstripe Bowl.
Put that out there, man.
But in terms of guys who are already going public with their plans to go to the portal, it's just two guys in that conversation, Chaz Coleman, and then junior cornerback Elliott Washington, who is no longer with the program. Terry Smith said there are still 4 confirmed opt-outs for Penn State, guys who are not going to play in the Pinstripe Bowl. That's defensive tackle Zane Durant, offensive guard Venga Ioane, running back Nick Singleton, and safety Zaki Wheatley. They're all seniors. We'll see how that pans out. Terry Smith has been said that we'll learn about those as they become confirmed, but I'd imagine there's some conversations being had, and there's also a situation where guys could play in the game, but they might not play beyond the first quarter. They might not play beyond the first half, expecting a significant youth movement over the course of action in Yankee Stadium that Saturday. Some notes from some calls that we had this week that are over at Lions247.com. Ethan Grunkemeyer, King Mack, part of those conversations. And I know you wrote on both of those guys, Daniel. I just wanted to throw it to you here. A lot more over there for our Pinstripe Bowl prep notes over at Lions247.com for what we heard from Terry Smith, what we heard from veteran players. But King Mack, Ethan Grunkemeyer warranted their own spotlight here for different reasons.
Yeah, I'll start with Grunkemeyer because I think that's a little bit more brief. And I think everyone knows sort of what the score is there. Is he going to come back? Is he going to go? He said that he hasn't made a decision yet, but he's had meetings with Matt Campbell, with Taylor Mauser, and is getting to know Jake Waters. And then, we'll see, what things look like for him. He's in an interesting situation as a, young quarterback with, some upside, but there's a lot of other quarterbacks out there who have played a lot more than him. If he were to hit that transfer for market. So, we'll see what that looks like. In terms of King Mack, we had a pretty, I think, wide ranging, discussion with him that, touched on a lot of different areas. I know that everyone has loved hearing all these different clips of the leaked audio of these meetings with Pat Kraft. And King Mack said that was sort of, earlier in his call, he had said that there was a lack of leadership on the team, which is something that Matt Campbell had identified and looked at as something to fix. And he said that, having that audio out there is an example of that shows that the lack of leadership that this team had, and that, the selfishness, that was a word that he used, that was inside of that locker room. Like I said, like I used this word earlier, nuance. I think that there's, a lot of different things that led to the season that Penn State had and the situation that, it's been in for the past couple of weeks and months. But I think it was some insight there into the culture, that had gotten to a certain point and, where things are going to go from here. So, I thought King Mack was pretty honest, about everything. An interesting, I think step off of this was I asked Terry Smith on Thursday that, King Mack talked about, a lack of leadership and, where things were. How do you feel about this locker room moving forward? Like, how do you feel about the leadership that could be in place next year, especially coming off a year like this? He gave us 3 names that he thinks are, pretty important to the leadership moving forward: King Mack, Anthony Donka, Tony Rojas. Yeah. So we'll see. That's with everything that, you can say a lot of things right now in terms of who's going to be here, who won't, all those different things. But, until we get to, late January, when the movement settles down at least. I think we can't say anything for sure, but I thought it was really interesting that in the context of those comments, for Terry Smith to put those three guys out there as, being important pieces moving forward. King Mack was talking like someone who was going to be back next year, didn't explicitly say it. And I think a lot of guys are in similar positions for various reasons. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think that, December 28th, I'm just imagining all the announcements we're going to get about guys leaving, guys coming back, all these different, I guess, permutations that you could imagine.
Why wait? It's a noon kickoff on the 27th. I mean, we got all evening for those kind of things. Yeah.
Who's going to be Jesse Lucetta at the Outback Bowl saying that he doesn't know, and then 15 minutes later putting out his statement?
Yeah, love Jesse, but that was a funny moment. We said, "Are you going to stick around for another year?" He said, "I'm not sure." By the time we got up to the press conference to write some post-game stories, he had already put the tweet out that he was gone. King Mack, a junior, Tony Rojas, a junior, and then the redshirt sophomore, Anthony Donko. To hear those names from Terry Smith is interesting. All three of those voices were heard in that leaked audio with Pat Kraft. And, of course, Tony Rojas, as I said a couple weeks ago, all those people who are getting their pitchforks out and their torches out to try to run him out of campus. You might need to go clean up some of your social media posts from recent weeks if he sticks around campus, because he could be one of the heart and soul figures for Penn State if he is here in 2026 at linebacker. And I think that could also go a long way towards retaining Amari Campbell at linebacker. Those two are close friends, but more conversation on the roster coming. I wanted to get to some recruiting notes to finish up this episode with you, Tyler. We've been talking about the recruiting impact of the staff. We've been talking about the portal and all this different stuff, but the 2026 class still has some room to grow, folks. Only 2 players signed before Matt Campbell got to campus. 4 former Iowa State signees have been added to Penn State's 2026 plans now in the last couple of weeks. And you referenced a guy from Jersey on our last episode, Tyler Calvaristo. That's very characteristic of you. But this guy from Jersey, Elijah Reeder, happens to be someone who signed with Iowa State and has now been released from his Iowa State signature. And as an edge rusher, could be a very important piece of the puzzle for Matt Campbell and company as they try to add more to this 2026 group.
Yeah, Penn State's in a really good spot there. Missouri's trying to make a run at Elijah Reeder. A few other schools kicking the tires as well. But it's not surprising to me that these programs are trying to make the late push. But Matt Campbell and his Iowa State staff were there from the start. They did a really good job keeping that one under the radar when they were at Iowa State. And Elijah Reeder is no longer under the radar. And he's not going to be signing until February, which it does open the door for other schools like Mizzou to make a push. But with that being said, all of the intel we have on our end is that Penn State's in a really, really strong position to secure a signature from Elijah Reeder when it's all said and done. I've pondered a crystal ball on several different occasions. We'll see if I ultimately get there. But again, the relationships with the staff, it's within the footprint. Elijah Reeder would like to play his college football a little bit closer to home. Penn State presents, I would say, an ideal opportunity to do just that. It's a staff he knows well. It's a staff he trusts. So a lot falling in Penn State's favor with Elijah Reeder. And if you're going to go look at Elijah Reeder's profile after hearing me go off about him and see, oh, well, he's not a 4-star prospect. He's a high 3-star guy. What's the appeal? Iowa State loved Elijah Reeder. They loved the traits, and now that staff is in State College. The evaluation doesn't change. Love the traits. There are a lot of people inside of Lash who are bullish on Reeder's upside, ceiling. Maybe not quite Chaz Coleman type ceiling, but he's up there as well. So he's a guy to keep an eye on moving forward very, very closely.
And then a little bit more long-term, but really right in front of our face now, Tyler, is the 2027 class. Once upon a time, Penn State had the top-ranked class in the country for that cycle. Now they have an empty cupboard, no prospects committed for the 2027 class. But they have really gone to work lately trying to restructure, reconfigure what that target board looks like. That's involved some re-offers to notable players, and that has involved some new offers. What do you want to bring here to the podcast on the subject?
Feels like we were never going to get to this point, but 2027 recruiting is back at the forefront of the conversation. Feels good because there are a lot of talented kids in that class that Penn State was in on, had Penn State pretty high on the list, and I think they've got a chance to stick similarly high on the list with this new staff now doing the recruiting. Khalil Taylor, top 24/7 wide receiver, in-state kid. He was committed until he got out the door before James Franklin's firing, but he's been reoffered. Leighton Von Brandt, who was fiercely loyal to James Franklin, Phil Trotwood during their tenure at Penn State, He has been reoffered by Ryan Clanton, and he likes Clanton. So there's an appeal there. I mentioned Bork earlier. There's been a ton of early offers to 2027 recruits who are not just highly ranked, but were very high on the board for Matt Campbell and his staff in Ames. And like I just said, the evaluations don't change because the colors are different now. Just because Campbell and his crew are down in the blue and white, those evaluations remain in place. So you're starting to see a little bit of a priority pecking order by some of these offers going out. And even guys who haven't publicly disclosed an offer from Penn State yet. They've talked to Kamon Spell. They've talked to Max Hitler. This staff has been as active as it could possibly be, hitting the ground running with 2027 recruiting. And I'll say this as well. Those front office guys at Penn State, Derek Hood, Trent Satterfield, those guys, everything I'm hearing, they're dogs. They're relentless on the trail. They're getting after those 27 guys. So if you're a Penn State fan, I think that's something you should be really encouraged by, because some of these cats in the 27 class, they're favoring certain schools right now. Some have even committed to other schools, like a guy like Colt Lumpris, a tight end we've talked about several times in the 27 class. He's committed to Alabama. I know there are relationships that need to be built back up, but there is a long way to go between now and the beginning of the early signing period for the 2027 class. And this Penn State staff is going to work really, really hard at getting back in on some of those guys. And you're seeing it. There have been a ton of offers this week.
And I'll turn your attention, folks, as we say goodbye, over to a new story up from national recruiting analyst Brian Doan.
Yeah, great piece.
Yeah, the strategy and significance of Penn State recruiting former Iowa State signees is the title there. And as we said, 4 of the 6 current members of the 2026 class for Penn State signed with Iowa State a couple weeks ago. I think you're going to see that number go up as well. So good story from Brian over at Lions247.com. We've got a lot of good stories from both these guys as well. I've thrown a few up there, and we got a lot more coming your way in the days ahead. This is a long episode, but to be honest, we hope that it helps you out for your holiday travel. And we also aren't going to be coming to you with probably more than one episode early next week, with the holiday landing sort of midweek and then a Saturday game. So hopefully this can hold you over for a bit. We'll see what happens in the next few days in terms of generated news. We will respond accordingly over at the site and then eventually here on the podcast. But Daniel, Tyler, appreciate your perspective, guys. Thanks as always for hopping on the pod. I'm Tyler Donahue. Thanks for watching or listening to the Lions 24/7 podcast.